I'm going to go ahead and make the hammer here. Now, this is the file that we start with. It's already got the construction lines done, and it's also got the measurements picture put up in here. So this is a surface with a picture attached to it. A little handy reference. You don't have to keep jumping back and forth between this and the manual. So it's all right there. The hammer is broken up into several parts. Now, realistically, of course, an actual hammer would not be made up of several parts. This would be stamped out of metal. This would be made out of plastic. These two would be attached somehow. But here, we're going to take advantage of the geometry to break it up into several parts and then join it all together. And that's reflected in the layers here. So you can see I've got a layer for curves, the layer for the head. So we have, this is the head of the hammer, the tang, that's the connecting part, the claw right there, the handle is there, the cutout is in there. So we're going to continue on with that, and we'll take a look at how to put all this together. So I'm going to start with the head, and I can see the head is actually made up of a couple of arcs of radius 21 and 4, and that's what the construction lines are actually for. First thing I'm going to do actually is I don't need a grid here. The grid is just kind of getting in the way and being distracting. So I'm going to turn on my grid options to turn off my grid lines. That just makes my life a little easier to see. So there's my construction lines. Now what I'm going to start with for the head is I need to make a circle here and another one here. Now the construction lines are already designed with the diameter of the curve in mind. So that means I can go circle, and I can first of all pick tangent to curves. So for tangent to curves, I want it tangent to this curve, tangent to this curve, and then lastly tangent to this curve. So there is the head of my hammer, tangent to those three curves. And again, the whole idea behind a tangent is that, of course, if you zoom in, you will see that the curve is parallel to the line. Now, of course, that doesn't make sense if you know anything about geometry, but if you zoom in close enough, they obviously look parallel. And a tangent curve will meet at a point. So the next curve I want to do is going to be over here in the corner. So I'm going to go curve, circle. Now this one I want tangent, tangent, radius. So it's going to be tangent to this curve, it's going to be tangent to that curve, and the radius is going to be 4. So I'm going to type in 4, press enter, and there's my curve right there. The next thing is I want to make a couple of arcs, and the arcs, taking a look at my reference here, so the arcs have a radius of 80 and a radius of 50, and I would also like those arcs to smoothly transition into these circles, so I'm going to make sure those arcs are also tangent. So jumping back to my top viewport, first of all I'll do the arc of radius 80. So I'm going to go curve, arc, and tangent, tangent, radius. So my first tangent curve is going to be up around here somewhere. My second tangent curve is going to be somewhere right about there. And my radius is going to be 80. Okay, so then you can see it narrows down my choices. Now, of course, this should work. If it doesn't work, give it a try again. Sometimes there's just a simple little issue of sequence of commands, like that. And there's my arc, radius 80. I'm going to repeat that command. First tangent curve is going to be trying close to that. Second one is going to be there. And my radius now is going to be 50, so 50. And that is the arc that I want right there. Okay, so now you can see I've got the head of my hammer is taking shape. I have this kind of curved teardrop here. These lines are tangent to my surfaces or my other circles. And it matches up with this diagram right here. So before I continue on, first what I'm going to want to do is I'm going to want to trim these curves. So to trim, the trim command works like this. First of all, select cutting objects. Well, I want to get rid of these parts of my circles. So my cutting objects are the arcs I just created, that and that. Press enter when done. Select object to trim. Well, I want to trim this part of the circle and this part of the circle. Now what will happen, press enter when done. What will happen is my arc will trim the circle right at a point where it meets the circle, and it'll also be tangent. That's why I made a tangent to this curve. So now I can take this curve. I'm going to turn off my gumball for now. I don't need that. I'm going to take these two curves. I'm pressing Shift Select to select all of my curves. I'm going to go to Edit and Join. And now I have a single curve that represents the head of my hammer. I'm just going to check in Properties here, Object Properties, that it is a closed curve. If you ever have trouble with steps like the next step, doing extrusions, watch out for closed curves or open curves. That's oftentimes the most common problem. So now I'm going to extrude my hammer, and I can see by my measurements, the measurement is 40. Now I would like to keep everything kind of centered on my construction plane. So I would like, because my hammer has kind of a nice lateral symmetry here, I would like to have half of it above my construction plane, half of it below my construction plane. So when I extrude this, solid extrude planar curve straight, I'm going to make sure that this selection, both sides equals yes, is chosen. If this is no, I'm only going to extrude in one direction. When I set this to yes, then I'm going to extrude in both directions. So I'm going to extrude that out by an amount that is half of the thickness or width of my hammerhead, which is 20. And there is my hammerhead. Now, made a slight mistake here in that I should have chosen my layers before I created that. And I said this was the head. This is actually the claw. That's okay. That's a quick little fix. I don't have to go back and redo it. I can go to its properties, and I can choose which layer I would like it to be on. I would like it to be on the claw layer. Okay, so now that is on the claw layer. So that's done correctly there. All right, so the next thing we're going to do is we're going to switch back to the curves layer, already there, and we're going to go ahead and make this head part right here. Now, I'm going to take a look here. I noticed there is a little bit of restriction. The little throat part here is 16 millimeters wide, and this is 42 millimeters wide. Now, that is already there in the construction lines, are 42 millimeters wide. I don't have a 16 millimeter wide reference there. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go into my curves menu. I'm going to add that one in. Actually, I'm going to turn off my construction line layer, unlock it rather. I'm going to switch to my construction line layer. I'm going to draw a curve, line, single line. So one from this point right here to, that'll be a good enough point right there. I'm going to go transform, move that from here, and I'm going to type in 8 because I want it to move 8 millimeters. Press enter. I want that to move 8 millimeters sideways, so I'm going to press shift to invoke ortho mode. Okay, so there's 8 millimeters on one side. I'm going to mirror that across this line. Okay, so there's another construction line right there. I'm just going to use that as a reference. So that's 16 millimeters wide, and that matches up this distance right here. Now the head is actually drawn more or less freeform. I'm going to lock that construction line layer again. It's not critical, but it's useful to have these numbers. So I'm going to start curve, freeform, control points. Now the trick here is, again, start inside of the claw, because the object we're going to create, we're going to merge it together. So we want to make absolutely sure that our curves are inside where we want them to be. So I'm going to refer to those and snap over here. Now again, really kind of depends how much curvature you want in the head, and it's not quite critical. Now, the last point I'm going to end up on is right here, and I'm going to make sure I'm going to snap to intersection here, where those two lines intersect. That's my last point of my control curve for the hammer head. And again, I can go ahead and I can modify that a little bit if I find it's just not quite what I wanted. Make it look a little bit more like maybe what it is in the diagram. It's not, again, really all that critical. Okay, so that's going to be my hammerhead. Now the other thing I want to make sure of, especially when object snaps are happening, is that if I'm going to draw a curve that is going to be, if I'm going to draw a curve, there, see the problem right there? If I'm going to draw a curve that I'm going to revolve, I've got to make sure all my points are, in fact, flat. Now, the problem here, you can see those construction lines I drew, I wasn't paying attention, and I snapped them to points that were not perpendicular. So, do I have to redo this again? No, there's a little fix for this. I'm going to turn on my control points. I'm going to select my entire curve here. I'm going to use my transform, set XYZ coordinates, and set Z. And now you can see it takes all my points, gives them the same Z coordinate, and if I snap to a point there, that flattens out my curve. Okay. So I made those construction lines poorly, wasn't looking in my perspective viewport. Fortunately, there was a quick fix for that, but should be paying more attention. So once I've done that curve, now I'm going to switch to the head layer. I'm going to do a surface revolve using this as my axis. Okay, and again, notice how it's snapping to that head point. I might actually want to turn that claw layer off, because I don't want to be snapping to anything on that claw. That's actually, as soon as you start mixing 2D and 3D points, that can happen, especially with grid snap. Grid snap doesn't necessarily tell you, oh, this line is not perfectly flat where you want it to be. So I'm going to choose that, full circle, okay, and there is the head of my hammer. Now, I want to do one thing that is not in the instructions, and that is to turn this into a solid. So right now it's a surface, and I find this whole assembly works better when you turn everything into a solid. So I'm going to cap planar holes there. So the command was solid and cap planar holes. And because everything worked out, I should get a nice planar hole to cap. So there is the head of my hammer. I also want to make sure that this flare does not go outside of the hammer claw. It's got to be inside. And you'll see why a little bit later. Turn my layers back on. There's my claw. All right. So I believe at this point it calls, the tutorial says to union these two. I'm going to wait till later. The next step I want to do is cut the hole in the claw. And I probably could have done that again when necessary. I'm going to take a look at my references here. Now, I'm not going to be too precise on this, just kind of roughly. So it's in about 39 millimeters, starts out about 8 millimeters wide, and goes out to 19 millimeters wide. Those construction lines are not there. You can actually see there's no vertical construction lines. So I might want to just add those in. Or the other thing I might want to do is this. I'm going to turn my grid back on. Okay. So if my grid's in millimeters, I can now actually count. So let's see. Let's just draw a line, curved line, just a little sacrificial line here. So curve, line. Let's go for, start with my, I'm going to turn my grid snap on. So let's see, 10, 20, 39. Okay, so that is 39 millimeters long. I'm going to move that from its end point to right about there. There's an intersection. So now I've got the rough depth for my hammer. A little bit hard to see that curve there, of course, because there are a couple of others. So what I might want to do is I'm just going to draw a line starting from there, and I'm going to go 4 millimeters up. Okay, and that should just reflect if this diameter is 8 millimeters, then that's going to be 4 millimeters is half of that. And then again, let's see, out there at the edge there, I'm going to draw one more line starting from there. And 19 over 2 is 9.5, so 9.5. And again, press shift straight up. Okay, so there's another line right there. So that'll give me roughly the construction lines I need for that curve. So again, I'm going to start off curve, freeform, control points, starting at that point right there. I'm going to make sure my next point is directly above that on the same line. And that way it'll make sure that I get a U shape instead of a V shape. And there's roughly, not going to be too critical about this. Okay, narrow that in a bit. And turn off. So again, I can sort of play around with that a little bit. Make sure that my curvature looks good. Went up a little too high with that. Now I can actually see I've got a bit of a concavity there. I don't want that. I want to make sure that this is actually convex. Okay, I am happy with that. I'm going to take that curve. Now, if you notice the curve, let's see where that curve ended up. So that curve, again, same thing happened. You notice that I used a combination of grid snap and endpoints. So that curve ended up a little bit wonky. So once again, I'm going to select all my points here, transform, set X, Y, Z. This time I'm going to flatten them out in the Y direction. Sorry, not the Y direction. In the X direction. There we go. That's better. Okay, so that curve is now flat. So this is a problem when you've got your grid snap on, you've got various objects going there. Probably what would have been smart was to turn that off and to turn that off as well. So, okay, so I've got that. Again, I'm going to do this a little backwards from the way the manual suggests it. I'm going to mirror this from here to here. And again, I want to make sure I've got those two curves that are tangent to each other, so they're going to meet at a U shape as opposed to a V shape. I'm going to join those two together. Control J joins them together. And I want to draw another line from the end point of this to the end point of that. And I'm going to join those together. All right, and again, just double check, make sure that is in fact a planar curve, because the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to extrude that curve straight, both sides, and I want to make sure that that is a solid. So this is what I'm going to use to hollow out the hammer claw. So I've got that now. I'm going to now rotate that. And roughly parallel that construction line right there. Move it up into the claw. See that it actually moves in. And again, I want to keep that depth. So that seems to match the profile that I sketched out there. And solid difference. That. Okay. Did not work. Let's try that again. Subtract from, press enter. Subtract, press enter. There we go. So there's the claw. When something doesn't work, try it again. Now I could actually see I was a little bit fooled there. Should have had that in a little bit deeper. I'm going to undo that. And we'll just see. We'll move that in a bit. I have to be careful when I'm moving things. This is why the gumball sometimes helps, is it lets you move things. There we go. That looks better. Okay, closer to my guideline there. Okay, so there is the hammerhead with the claw and the hammer. And the next step, I'm going to join these together, and then I'm going to do the fillet of the edges. So now when I'm joining these two objects together, I'm going to do a solid and union. And when you union things together, what it does is the first object is the layer that everything is going to be copied to, and the second object will be copied to that layer. So press enter. Okay, so notice that everything is green. My head just changed color. That's because now this is all one single object, and it's been moved to the layer. Well, this part has been moved to the layer that this was originally on. It always moves to the first layer. And if I go into wireframe mode, you can actually see that the inside, that part, flared out part, disappeared. So a union means it joins together and there's no surfaces that are inside of each other. It all works as one single object. Okay, I'm going to do the fillet edge. So solid fillet edge. And I'm going to select that edge. Let's try okay, 1 millimeter actually seemed to be pretty good. Let's see what happens if I have a slightly bigger fillet. So radius of 3. Let's try that. Okay. That one works as well. And again, fillet edge is one of those commands. It's a little bit tricky to work with. You kind of have to play around with your radii. And I'm just going to fillet all my other edges as well. Notice how the edges also match the curves. They've been broken up as well. And let's see what this one looks like. Actually, I'm going to leave that unfilleted because that should be a sharp edge for lifting out nails. Okay, so that'll be part one. We made the head. The next part, we will make everything else in the hammer.